Here's where we are. Just as a sort of refresher, we have now sort of worked our way down to this sort of third level of the stack. We have spent some time here talking about a Sinatra app that is just this very simple framework. We have not talked about databases at all because our app we did with Sinatra was not complicated enough to require one. And also, Sinatra doesn't give you any specific facilities for doing that. It lets you plug in whatever you want, but it doesn't give you sort of any built-in way to say, I have things I want to put in a database. Here's how I would do it. Now we're going to sort of dive down and look at a particular framework, Rails, which is organized along a very opinionated set of architectural lines, which is called Model View Controller, which means that your app contains three kinds of things, and the relationship among those things and the roles that they have are very well defined. So here's the MVC design pattern. Generically speaking, a model is some type of entity that your app manipulates. So going back to the movie database example, you can imagine a movie listing is a kind of thing. It's a model. It has a bunch of attributes. You can ask various questions about it. And the goal is that the parts of the app that do stuff to that data structure, that in some sense, that's what your app is. Your app is a thing that manipulates persistent data in some interesting way. So we're going to separate out that responsibility from the two other responsibilities that come with software as a service. What are those two other responsibilities? Well, one of them is the view, the thing that a human being, presumably at a web browser or a phone app or whatever, has to interact with. That's the human being's view, literally, of what's going on, how to get at the data, how to request changes to be made, and so forth. And the controller, which mediates between the two things. So in the classic model view controller framework, as represented by the mysteriously pixelated, that's weird. If I back up, does it get any better? Wow, that's a weird deterministic bug. Microsoft, you've done it again. In the classic model view controller framing, the responsibilities are that the model is where the data and all of the actions associated with that data tend to live. Human beings interact with the view, and through the view, they can communicate their intentions to the controller. Intentions like search for something or make a change to this data. The controller mediates those user interactions, and it converts what the user says they want into some specific set of calls against the model. In many cases, those calls will involve asking the model to return some data that can be presented, and that controller will arrange to make that data available back to the view. Right? So the controller sort of is the traffic cop. It's the first place in your app where your code gets hit. And as we'll see, that actually leads to some pitfalls if you're not careful about app design. So how does this fit with other things we've been talking about, like resources and restfulness and stuff like that? Well, in fact, in a typical model view controller app, there isn't just one model. There's kind of a model per resource. So going back again to our movie database example, one kind of resource in the movie database is a movie and all the information about that movie. So we can imagine that there is a controller that is in charge of mediating various different views. So you can imagine there might be a view for a list of movies filtered by criteria. There might be a view for details of a movie. There might be a view that allows the user to submit a movie, like through a form. But also, if you're a user of that database, as a moviegoer, you are another kind of entity. Information about you as a user and which movies you like and maybe which reviews you have written for other movies. So that is a different kind of resource, and it has its own model, which has its own operations, its own data structures, and a controller that mediates between that model and views related to things about moviegoers. You might also imagine that similarly there are reviews, and that internally these models have relationships to each other. For example, it doesn't really make sense to talk about a review without talking about who wrote it, or without talking about what movie it's about. So somewhere in terms of the model code, there are relationships that have to be expressed among these different kinds of resources. But generally speaking, this is the template. Each type of resource that is its own thing has its own model. It has its own controller that mediates access between that model and the different views that a user could interact with. And when I say view, a view could also be like an API call that returns a JSON data structure. That's also a view, right? It's just not HTML, it's a JSON view. So that's the general schema of the application. And when the browser interacts with this, it is essentially interacting with some controller via some set of views. There's other ways to do this. Model view controller is not the only way to organize an app. Page controller, which is a little more like what Sinatra is, basically just says there's one big app and there's kind of a handler, like a function, and that handler is responsible for generating a particular page or a particular view. That's kind of what we did on Tuesday, where each of our little stub functions in our Sinatra app was responsible for generating a particular page, rather than saying there's different kinds of resources with models. You can also do something called front controller, which is there's sort of one big app that all traffic comes in through. It is responsible for figuring out which model to dispatch things to, and it controls which views can get rendered. So you can sort of think of it as an Uber controller or something like that. And there's template view, which is similar to model view controller, but there isn't really a view. Old school PHP apps are often authored in this way, where you have a bunch of logic, but the logic is largely built around the fact that you're embedding a view. So when you're doing a PHP app, there's sort of this sense, or at least I thought there was when I used to do PHP, that you're really working backwards from what's the view. And when the PHP code gets too bulky to cram into the view, you try to pull it out into its own file. But really what you're doing is there's business logic, the models, and there's views. And there isn't really a first-class abstraction for how to mediate between those things. Like the kinds of things Sinatra was doing for us, like parsing params, mapping routes directly to pieces of code that you write. Those are the kinds of things that are within the purview of the controller, because it mediates between the user and everything else. To the best of my knowledge, especially in older PHP apps, there isn't really any equivalent to that. So there are various ways you can organize a SaaS app. Model view controller, to me, kind of makes sense, because what is a web browser? It's a thing that presents views. What is a database? It's a thing that stores data for lots of related kinds of entities, right? Like a database table is basically one row in the table is one instance of some kind of a thing, a movie, a review, a moviegoer. And a controller is basically the logic needed, like we just saw in Sinatra, to wrap some HTTP mechanics around accessing that data. So to me, it just sort of makes sense. But the real lesson here is Rails is an MVC framework. That's great if your app is a natural fit for that. If it is not, other architectures may be better, including for very simple apps, Sinatra, which doesn't have strong opinions about organizing the app in a certain way.